So I have some troubling news to share today. Ever since the election, even amongst people that felt that something didn't seem right with the results on the Democratic side, people have mostly kept quiet or restrained themselves about the idea that the election was quote unquote stolen in some way, because that's what Republicans did in 2020. It was all lies. And not only do Democrats not want to be accused of the same thing, but they also don't want to fall victim to the same personal bias of thinking that an election that you lost must have been stolen. And I fell into that category. I have not wanted to say anything about the idea that this election wasn't legitimate because there has not been any evidence for that. People have made claims that Elon Musk was messing with Starlink machines that counted votes, and there's been hints of that from Donald Trump and blah, 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 but there's no evidence for it. And look, a half-baked, broken thought out of the mind of Donald Trump is not enough to constitute any type of real evidence of what Elon Musk did or did not do. And short of some kind of leaker revealing information that there was a directive within Starlink to mess with the vote counts, there's just no evidence that anything happened there. Even if it did, there's no evidence for it. So there's no claim to be made there. And until now, no real tangible claims have been made about wrongdoing on the part of Republicans in this election. There was a lot of talk beforehand about the voter suppression efforts that Republicans always do, and the vast scale to which they were mounting those suppression efforts in this election. So there was reporting on that, but we haven't heard anything about that since the election and about how that affected the election until now. A independent journalist named Greg Palast, who has worked with the BBC, he's worked with The Guardian, he's worked with the New York Times. This is a very esteemed journalist who's done a lot of reporting on presidential elections, labor, and other very important issues, energy companies, lobbying, that sort of thing. This is a legitimate source. He's a reliable source. And he is now laying out the case that by his calculations, Kamala Harris would have received at least another 3,565,000 votes. And he asserts that based on his calculations of votes that were cast and purged and not counted, that Kamala Harris would have won the election in key swing states like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Wisconsin. And he lays out a very clear case for what Republicans did to create this result. So I'm going to go over some key numbers. I recommend you look at this yourself. There's a video about it that he did, an interview. I suspect he'll be doing more. I want to see more people talking about this. I want to see more people running their own numbers on this. Because as of right now, this guy, though he is very credible, he's the only person talking about this. And basically the way he sees it is that 4,776,000 voters were purged from voter rolls, wrongly purged from voter rolls, in his words, according to the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission data. There's also a new form of voter suppression that involves vigilante voter fraud hunters, which challenge the legitimacy of voters on the voter rolls. And these are normal people. They're not experts. They're not anybody who's affiliated with any kind of actual credible organization that does this type of work. These are average Americans, many of them Republicans, probably all of them Republicans, that essentially can call someone's place, someone's right to vote into question by reporting it. And there is reports that on election day or by election day, the challenges exceeded 200,000 in Georgia alone. So what this means is that you can challenge somebody's right to vote on the voter roll. So you point out their name and you say, this is questionable. And the person is then removed from the voter roll, and the only way for them to vote is by casting a provisional ballot. And then many provisional ballots were rejected and not counted. He counts 1,216,000 provisional ballots were rejected. There are also 3.24 million new registrations that were rejected or not entered on the rolls in time to vote. 585,000 ballots cast in precinct that were disqualified. No less than 2 million mail-in ballots were disqualified for minor clerical errors, which is similar to what the 585,000 ballots that were cast in precinct would have been disqualified for as well. These are small things, smudges, and supposedly the signatures not matching. Palast notes that in 2016, 2.5 million provisional ballots were cast, and 42.3% of them were never counted. So that means over 1 million Americans lost their vote. Though, he notes, no one was charged with attempting to vote illegally. And you'll see that in 2024 as well. These are millions of ballots that were thrown out. Many provisional ballots that were thrown out because they had supposedly signatures that didn't match, and yet nobody was charged with any crime. That's forgery. That's a federal crime. Nobody is charged, just their ballots thrown out and their votes disenfranchised. And he notes that the vigilante challenges were not in place in 2016 or 2020. In 2024, 40,000 volunteer vigilantes were signed up by an organization called True the Vote, which is a Trump-supported organization. They signed up 40,000 volunteer vigilantes. And by August of 2024, they said, according to their numbers, that they had already challenged 317,886 voters in dozens of states and projected that by Election Day, they would have challenged over 2 million voters. So that means that these were registered voters who were knocked off of the voter rolls. And if they went to vote on Election Day or early, they were told that they can't vote and they were handed a provisional ballot. The thing about a provisional ballot is if you sign it and you vote and you send it in, you actually don't know if your vote ever got counted. And because they were curing all of these provisional ballots, and in some cases just throwing them in the trash, 1,216,000 provisional ballots were rejected and not counted. And if your ballot had to be cured, that's just another set of hoops that you had to jump through to get your vote counted, and that was if you were ever even informed that your vote wasn't counted in the first place. The other thing that Palast points out is that almost all of these voters whose votes were thrown out, almost all of the people who were purged from the voter rolls, almost all of the people whose provisional ballots were rejected, were black and brown people. These are voter suppression efforts that are specifically targeted at black people, immigrant communities, high propensity Democrat voting communities like students, but for the most part, black and brown people. And they can target it that way too, based on where you live, your zip code, your registration. They can see your registration. They might not be able to see which way you voted, but they can see your voter registration. They can see where you're from, and they can see your name. A lot of ballots were rejected or called into question by these vigilantes based on names like James Brown or a last name Jackson or Hernandez, things like that. These were methods that were used to purge people from the voter rolls. So a lot of these people probably never got to vote, or if they did vote or attempted to vote, their vote may never have been counted. And this was definitely targeted at black voters and likely Democrat voters. And that's how Greg Palast arrives at the conclusion that not only were 4 million voters purged and 1 million provisional ballots rejected and not counted, but that Kamala Harris, if it were not for these suppression efforts, would have won the election. He asserts that she would have won Georgia, she would have won Pennsylvania, and I think he said Arizona and Wisconsin. So look into his numbers yourself. There's a lot of details to this. And in the midst of rumors about this election being stolen, the general fishiness of it, that all of these Democratic voters which voted against Donald Trump in 2020 simply disappeared. I did not want to jump onto narratives about election theft or even voter suppression because I wasn't seeing any proof to any claims. I wasn't seeing anybody making any substantiatable claims about how an election was stolen, by what means, and what the implications are. We have that now. This is real evidence from a credible source. And it may be necessary for other people to look at this and run their own numbers. And there's not a lot of cross-referencing happening on this right now because there's not a lot of talk about this going on in mainstream media. Because frankly, the left of center media, or center media if you want to call it that, they are afraid to talk about this. They're not going to want to talk about this because they don't want to be accused of being the election deniers now. But here's the thing. First of all, Donald Trump is already in office. Nobody tried to stop him from being certified because there was no evidence presented at any time up until now that the election was won on illegal grounds. And look, even with all of this voter suppression, that's still, by our current standards, supposedly a free and fair election. And so that's why I think this is grounds for an actual overhaul. We are talking about a country and a Republican Party that has purposely purged and disenfranchised black and brown voters. And we already knew that that was happening. They've always done that. There's been reporting going back years that they do this. None of this is new. This is not conjecture. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a Republican strategy. They absolutely do this. But now we have some data that shows that it was to an extent that would have changed the outcome of the election. That is absolutely unprecedented. And given what Donald Trump is doing and has promised to do in the federal government, this is grounds for an actual revolution, in my opinion. And so here's what I think the game plan needs to be. And this is bold. This is certainly not something that I have the power to do myself, but it is something that we could start talking about. And it's something that we could start contacting labor leaders, Democratic leaders, community leaders of all kinds, and start pushing for aggressively, and especially if this data presented by Greg Palast continues to be borne out, then we need to absolutely continue to apply pressure on the idea that this was an illegitimate election. And it's very simple. 3,565,000 votes that would have gone to Kamala Harris were thrown out. These were registered voters who were disenfranchised, who voted. So that is very different from saying some vague claim about election fraud and it's all in some mysterious thing that the Democrats or Elon Musk did that caused the votes to change. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about verifiable claims that 3 million votes, 3.5 million votes that would have gone to Kamala Harris were purged. So here's what I think needs to be done. An immediate full-scale general strike demanding the removal of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance from office on the grounds of explicitly violating the Constitution and being illegitimately elected. So a general strike, to the extent that it could be mounted, would bring the entire economy of America to a halt. It would be the American people at large, union members. Many of these people that were purged from the voting rolls, this was in Pennsylvania, these were union members. Not all of them, but plenty of them, I'm sure. And so the unions need to be appealed to, that the democracy that, frankly, allows them to have the power that they have. One of the things that Trump has done now is deadlocked the NLRB so that there will be no legal movement for unions at all in the course of the Trump presidency. So unions are being disenfranchised by Donald Trump as well. So now is the time for them to use their power and call for a general strike across America. And what that would do is put labor leaders and all of us in a position to make demands of Congress that they cannot refuse. So that needs to start with the removal from office of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. There can be no compromise on that point. They have to go. And that can happen. Congress can be forced to remove them from office. But that's where the pressure needs to be applied. And if there's a general strike and the U.S. economy grinds to a halt, Congress is going to be forced to bend to the demands of the American people. They will have to. Then a constitutional amendment needs to be added that stipulates the president does not have immunity from crimes committed while in office. Jack Smith and his full team is to be reinstated, and the federal investigation into Donald Trump's 2020 election interference will continue. A new constitutional amendment will be added that states in the event that tangible evidence proves voter suppression to an extent that changes the outcome of an election, the presidential election results are nullified and a runoff election will be held. Neither Donald Trump nor J.D. Vance will be qualified to run for office. So this part is tricky because the question is, by what standard does voter suppression have to be proved to trigger an amendment like this? And I mean, this is crazy. No amendment like this or any measures to redo an election have ever existed in America. But if there's a time to institute something like that, it's now. And maybe I'm not the one who can figure out how to make that rule the most bulletproof, but I think that is the gist of it. A runoff election needs to be held immediately with ranked choice voting nationwide and open primaries in all parties. Now, impeaching Trump and J.D. Vance would make Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, the president temporarily. In this event, depending on the cooperation of the Republican Party, the general strike will reduce to intermittent nationwide striking to allow the economy to breathe as a runoff election is planned and executed. So this is an important part, and understand that there's a compromise happening here. And while I understand that for a lot of people, the idea, especially in a scenario like this, compromising with Republicans would be off the table, a non-starter, except for the fact that I don't see any way that the Republican Party could be effectively disempowered. I don't see a path to that in the same way that I see a path to forcing the Republican Party to remove Donald Trump from power. And doing that, what it would do is it would force the Republican Party to discipline themselves. So the head of the current Republican Party would be removed, and a strike of this kind triggering a new election would disincentivize the Republican Party or any party from doing this again. So that's important. And I think the idea of even allowing Republicans to be in power at all would be a compromise in this situation. Because, them being guilty of this, it amounts to an entire party-wide treason of America. But the problem is identifying which Republicans are responsible for that and through which means and how they would be held accountable. That seems impossible. I don't see a path to that. But in an ideal world where a general strike was called tomorrow, Donald Trump could be impeached within a day or two. So all of this is possible, at least in my opinion. And look, I'm just spitballing here. I'm certainly not a constitutional scholar, but I do know that there's no force in the country more powerful than labor. If a general strike is called, all of these things are on the table. Understand that. In the event of a general strike, all of these things are definitely on the table. And more would have to be done to make sure that this is as airtight of a plan as it could possibly be. But this is just the idea that I have for now. So, as the runoff election is planned, there need to be international, nonpartisan election watchdogs who are involved in that process from the UN or elsewhere They must be brought in, they help plan the runoff election, and then they monitor the election for voter purging, voter suppression, and yes, voter fraud. These international watchdogs will be in the country with round-the-clock union protection until the vote is casted and counted. Because of the absence of a vice president, this watchdog group will certify the election by unanimous consent. If they do not unanimously certify the election, the intermittent or general strikes will continue until another runoff can be held. Rinse and repeat until a free and fair election is certified. This watchdog group must be chosen and agreed upon democratically amongst union leaders, preferably, before the impeachment of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, and if possible, before the general strike is called. So, this would be a difficult maneuver, and it does contradict the way elections are done as per the Constitution. But this is why a general strike would have to be leveraged to force Republicans to legislate this and make it happen. And they can have no breathing room in that case. This has to be executed exactly as the unions that vote on it dictate that it will. And so that's my thoughts on what to do in this situation. I don't know if that could work. I'm not an expert on this stuff. Some of you guys can tell me more about if you think this would work, why you think it's stupid, why you think it won't work. I'm sure there are reasons, there are definitely flaws in this plan. However, the core of it is that unions united, and especially if a general strike can be mounted in this country, that is the opportunity for us to fundamentally change how our country responds in the event of an election being stolen in this way. And this is not an election conspiracy, election denial. This is very straightforward information that voter suppression is the reason why Donald Trump was able to win this election. And look, we just can't stand for that. We can't. So I ask all of you to imagine a world where the unions of America don't stand for that, and instead stand up to Donald Trump and the Republican Party by putting their hands in their pockets and refusing their labor. If that happens, the leverage of this country and the political situation of this country will transform overnight. And so I think we need to start talking about this. First and foremost, we need to start spreading the word that 3.5 million votes were purged or disqualified that would have gone to Kamala Harris. That is a substantiatable claim that you can spread and repeat to people, and you can look into it yourself. And I'm sure more research and digging into these numbers will happen. And we can start to spread the word about this. And it might be hard at first because some people might just hear it as more election denial. But guess what? This is the truth. This is the truth. Republicans are documented in their efforts of voter suppression historically. This is the country that has had slaves for longer than it has not had slaves. This is the country where civil rights and the Civil Rights Act was only made possible through rioting in the streets and strikes, sit-ins, other kinds of public demonstration. And now, in America, enough voters, black and brown voters, are being purged from the rolls and disenfranchised to disallow the first black woman candidate of a major party from winning the election. America cannot stand for this. And so we need to start talking about it now. And while I think that this is immediately grounds to mount enormous labor action to the end of forcing the Republican Party to do something about this, I also recognize that it might not be the immediate flashpoint that people need in order to enact real change. But Donald Trump is fully on course to crashing the economy of this country. Even just with what he tried to do by revoking federal loans, etc. I mean, we are talking about literally collapsing the country. in very short order. So it's only a matter of time. With the abuses of power that Donald Trump is prone to, and the fact that Donald Trump's Project 2025 presidential agenda amounts to one giant abuse of power. Eventually, probably very soon, Donald Trump will overstep and create the conditions through which real opposition can be mounted against him. And those are the conditions not only where unions could be convinced to do a general strike, but also average Americans could be convinced to be on board with that. This is very simple, very simple. 3.5 million people who should have been able to vote were disallowed from voting and disenfranchised. And because of that, Donald Trump won. Donald Trump was not elected by some mandate in the country, some shift of the demographic no. I bought into that before. What I was waiting for is information that proves that to be false. And in my opinion, we have that now. So we need to start very serious conversations about what happens from here. I gave my ideas. I'd like to hear yours. I'm going to try to send this plan to various union leaders, movement leaders, organization leaders, Democratic Party leaders. We need to start pushing them very aggressively to do something, to act urgently. Even in the case of Donald Trump's federal spending freeze, Democrats' initial response to that was not strong. Democrats' initial response to Donald Trump's overreaches in general was not strong. And the backlash against them for that was immediate. And so now they're moving with a tiny bit more urgency. It's still not nearly enough. They still have no idea what to do. So maybe we need to spell it out for them. But either way, we need to start being as aggressive as possible in making it clear that this election was absolutely not legitimate. The election of Donald Trump was not legitimate, and something needs to be done about it immediately. And hold on to your hats.